Hi, my name is Jenny Liu. I'm a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm thrilled to be here today, back visiting Germany. I had formerly lived in Hamburg from 2014 through 2015. I'm thrilled to be here today. Thank you, Pamela Pernis and Heine Griebel, for organizing this talk. I'm interested in learning more about the local deaf and deafblind communities here in Germany and look forward to conversations to come. This talk is a culmination of our research and analysis and is called Becoming Protactile: Forging Tactile Channels in Perceptual and Language Socialization. In 2021, when I finished my PhD, I did not know what was to come. I fortunately got a postdoc job working with 2 advisors. Tara Edwards was one of them. She asked me if I was interested in working on a project related to protactile language and the deafblind community. I elatedly said yes. The first part of the postdoc was to travel to Oregon. Tara basically shipped me off there. I arrived alone. It was during COVID, at the end of 2021. I did not know what to expect during this time of uncertainty. In Oregon, there is a protactile PT house where many deafblind people resided and socialized. It is run by a deafblind researcher and leader named Yelitsa Nuccio. I went there for a 3 to 4 week of protactile immersion, and I had thought it would be a breeze. I was proved wrong. I ran into many communicative obstacles. Moments of misunderstandings ensued. Communication felt tenuous and unclear. During the 3 to 4 weeks of training, on one evening, Yelitsa approached me and announced, "I have a task for you." She had piqued my curiosity. You and Hal, another researcher, have been residing in the sighted world. But it is imperative that you get a taste of the deaf-blind world and their ontological experiences. I would like you to try and cook dinner blackout style while wearing a blindfold. Hal and I shared a moment of surprise and nervous excitement. This is the hilarious video that depicts the dinner. The video shows us bustling around and cooking in the kitchen. At the beginning, Hal and Yelitsa were brainstorming. Then I approached them with an attempt to formulate what I was cooking to Hal. But Hal did not understand me. There was a communication breakdown. But then Yelitsa remedied that breakdown. Watch closely.
Blackout dinner. Yelitsa challenges her deaf and hearing friends to cook blindfolded.
Jenny, I am cooking some noodles.
Hal, what? I did not catch what Jenny said. Yelitsa, she is filling up a pot with water, and then the water will boil and the pot will shake. Noodles are then added. Hal, oh.
Description. I was interacting with Hal, who has brown curly hair and was wearing black blindfolds and a black shirt. I was wearing white blindfolds and with my hair pulled back and a black shirt. Yelitsa was facing us, standing close to us. She has brown hair that is pulled back and is wearing earrings and also a black tank top. I was trying to explain to Hal that I was cooking noodles in American Sign Language. That went over her head. In quotations, I did not understand what she said. There was a communication breakdown between us. I left and resumed my cooking. Mystified, Hal asked Yelitsa. Yelitsa explained again, translating. Pot. She took Hal's hands for that production. Pot. Fill pot with water. Shaking pot. Fire under pot. This means water is boiling. Noodles in pot. As you see here, when you compare mine and Yelitsa's depictions, they are carried out differently. Yelitsa makes use of contact space. And uses Hal's hands and arms for that production. That was accessible for Hal. Yelitsa's depiction of noodles, its process, and tactile aesthetics was not in ASL, but produced in a new protactile language. She makes use of phonological principles and the spatial lexicon in protactile. This is incredible. What explains this radical difference in our language? How did protactile language diverge from ASL over time? First, I would like to provide you with a brief history of protactile language. Protactile emerged in the United States in Seattle, Washington, and spread to Oregon, throughout the Midwest, and across the country. Protactile language requires particular social conditions to flourish. For example, the right people need to be granted legitimate positions of power within a milieu that has relaxed its inhibitions around touch. There, as well as other features, stimulate and nourish the growth of protactile language. Seattle's deafblind community is composed of a high density of deafblind people who grew up sighted learning American Sign Language and whose vision changed, later becoming blind. They tried to get by with ASL despite it being difficult to see. But this resulted in misinformation, strained interactions, and breakdowns in communication. Deafblind people tried to grasp American Sign Language signs by touching signers' hands, but many ASL signs inherently difficult to feel. For example, the ASL words mom and dad. Mom, an open hand with the thumb touching the chin. Dad, an open hand with a thumb touching the forehead. Without a visual locative frame, the two words are indistinguishable. And meaning becomes difficult to interpret. When deafblind people felt that direct communication with one another in tactile ASL was ineffective, they resorted to using sighted hearing interpreters. In this scenario, each deafblind person was paired with an interpreter. And all information they received through the interpreter was indirect and secondhand. Over time, deafblind leaders began using new communication practices centered around touch. Many deafblind people were taken aback by these novel tactile interactions with the environment and people that internalized sighted norms, beliefs, and values around touch, and initially felt that touching in general was not appropriate. This apprehension was countered by deafblind leaders who affirmed touch as a means of getting information firsthand, thereby increasing a deafblind person's sense of autonomy. These deafblind leaders sought information themselves, no longer relying on interpreters as a source of information. Instead, they got in touch with their environment. When grocery shopping, they touched the fruits and vegetables to determine what to buy. They chose an apple, for example, by evaluating its tactile qualities from a tactile frame. Navigational patterns changed. For example, if walking to a door on the opposite side of a room, one would follow a path around the perimeter of the room, staying in contact with the wall as one made their way to the door. They realized they could use tactile affordances inherent in the world. These developments led to other tactile practices, which caught on with more deafblind people in the community, and they began following them as well. This is how new protactile practices became conventionalized. As deafblind people began to value touch, they initiated a protactile way of being at home, at work, and in their day-to-day lives. In this way, the adoption of new protactile practices led to the emergence of a new language. At that point, their language began to diverge from ASL, and the signs they had formerly used evolved into new forms compatible with tactile modality. Growth occurred especially rapidly within the spatial lexicon. ASL words that did not fit protactile patterns were abandoned. Next, I would like to show you some clear distinctions between PT and ASL. In this video, two deafblind people, John and Yelitsa, describe the difference between walk in ASL versus PT. The word walk, produced in ASL in airspace. This word was initially borrowed into PT and then underwent changes so that it followed phonological protactile rules by using contact space. PT, walk, contact space, watch closely. The spatial vocabulary of protactile, let's use this ASL sign indicating a person walking with the index finger or one hand shape like this. That ASL sign isn't clear to us. To simply substitute the ASL hand shape with the movement of the index and middle fingers doesn't work either because it's still in airspace. Since there's no good way to ground that sign in contact space, we have rejected it outright. Instead, we have the protactile word walk, signed like this, with the index and middle fingers walking in contact space around the leg, forearm, or chest. This sign can take place in many locations and can be modulated to describe a variety of types of movement, walking as well as running. Using this sign eliminates the need to use other signs produced in airspace, such as the ASL sign for run. Instead, it can be simply articulated in protactile and contact space, thereby making it possible to express the manner of movement or speed. Notice that all the meaning is expressed through touch. ASL features that depict running include shoulder and head movements, for example, are not protactile and they can't be borrowed in. This is just one of many examples. John, how about run like this, which represents each pumping of the legs? Now try it for yourself. Feel the difference between walk in a visual versus protactile language. pair up with a buddy. Find someone in the room now. Sit together and make contact with your leg, like this. Facing each other, legs in contact. Now, with your partner, pick who is the speaker and pick who is the listener. Are your hands in contact? The person who is producing, produce the sign for walk in your preferred sign language, ASL or DGS. Optional, close your eyes. How did you feel or comprehend that? Now, take advantage of contact space. Take advantage by using your partner's leg. Produce walk and protactile using the leg. Did your understanding differ between these words? How did your partner receive that? Any questions so far? Current study. The history of protactile language emergence. I just outlined how the language took root in the community through protactile socialization, occurring among deafblind adults. There were no children involved. Research to date on Nicaraguan Sign Language and other emerging sign languages have shown us that child language learners make important contributions to emerging languages. In 2020, we discovered groups of deafblind kids in the United States who had not been exposed to protactile language. This presented an opportunity to bring a deafblind adult researcher who is a protactile language expert with deeply embedded protactile social practices into interaction with deafblind children. Across the duration of this study, the children were visited in their homes over 4 months. We had 2 research questions. The first one was, what conventionalized social practices underlie language development? Typically, research studies generate quantitative data such as word counts, the number of words a child acquires over time, or at a grammatical level, how kids string words. These are ways we measure. But what is rarely, if ever, discovered is the social practices required for language itself to develop. To get at that question, we collected detailed observations made by the deafblind adult researcher who wrote ethnographic field notes after each visit with the deafblind children. In them, she described her observations, tactile data gathered from each child and their home environment, the types of interactions they shared with their hearing-sighted parents and others as they were exposed to protactile for the first time. The research process was exceedingly rich in qualitative data, containing an abundance of information about social practices required for language development. This will be outlined in more depth in the next section of this talk. Our second research question, which is a linguistic one. How does the presence of the child learners in their first-time interactions with the adult shape protactile language use? Past research has shown that the minds of young children function differently than the minds of older language learners. Children take in and interpret information differently, a constraint which often results in adult speakers adjusting their language as they direct it toward a child. The same phenomenon occurred here. We examined the changes a deafblind adult protactile speaker made to their language when interacting with a child who's unfamiliar with protactile practices and language. To do this, we analyzed one specific domain of protactile language that had become conventionalized and was fairly well established in the language previously documented by Dr. Edwards and Dr. Brentari in 2021. This feature is called protactile tapping, and I'll explain more in the next slide.
Back-channeling taps have a discourse function. Take two speakers seated together in protactile contact shown here. As the first speaker expresses language to the second speaker utilizes back-channeling taps to indicate that they are understanding the message. These taps provide information, back-channeling cues like head nodding, indicating that the person is following. Over time, these back-channeling taps were extended to provide a linguistic function. These are called demonstrative taps. These demonstrative taps function similarly to the English words this or that, or ASL pointing demonstratives. The video to the right on the slide shows a woman and a man seated. The woman moves her hand across to show where a folded fabric napkin, I believe. When they reach the corner, the woman taps it, singling out this particular corner of the object. This one, that one. Demonstrates tapping again. Tapping shows up frequently in protactile language and has a variety of other functions, but I won't be mentioning those in this talk. In this situation, where a child learner is interacting with an adult speaker, one interesting finding was that tapping took on even more functions in the presence of a child. We call these meta-channel taps, and I will explain these more in the following slide. Before though, I want to show an example of back-channeling taps, and then the example of demonstrative taps. Back-channeling. Speaker 2 wearing black pants is tapping on the leg of speaker 1 in brown pants. Demo. Brown-haired woman moves her hand on the napkin while speaker 2 follows. Video recorded long stretches of adult-child interaction by identifying instances of tapping and assigning functional tapping categories to each tap. Taps predominantly fell into two categories shown here to my right. Me pointing to that slide is an example of an ASL demonstrative. The first category, demonstrative taps, occurred in child-adult interactions when the adult wanted to call the child's attention to something. The adult tapping one toy out of an assortment, telling the child that this toy in particular was what they should attend to. Or it can be an introduction to a new object. These are examples of demonstrative functioning of taps. A second category with a high frequency of observations was meta-channel taps. Meta-channel taps, interestingly, don't show up very often in adult-adult PT interactions. However, in interactions with children, they showed up frequently. Meta-channel taps have a meta-communicative function, which is not really language as such, but they teach a child how to use language. For example, an adult might direct the child to use their arms and hands through tapping. Use your hands, not your leg. Or mouth no on mouth and PT. Do not use your mouth, but use your hands. They are critical articulators for tactile exploration and language. In sum, these taps were used to teach the child which parts on their bodies were most appropriate for protactile sociality and communication. We analyzed the data gathered during the 4-month study duration with 2 children, Anna and Jad. Anna was 3 years and 3 months old, and Jad was 3 years and 5 months old. We had 2 different forms of data. 1, visual data captured via video recording. 2, as well as tactile data. Visual data was not able to capture and record tactile aspects of interactions. Tactile encoded data would be ideal. In order to generate tactile data, we went through a process of protactile reenactment. To reenact tactile data, our sighted and deafblind researchers collaborated. The sighted researcher would watch a segment of video data and role play with the deafblind researcher, one in the role of the child and the other in the role of the deafblind researcher, alternating at intervals. Props were frequently used to represent a toy, and in this way, protactile enactments were generated from video data. We tested for cross-modal reliability, meaning we calculated reliability between visually coded data and tactilely coded data. These reliability scores were not high, but the process was methodologically novel and interesting. Then we calculated scores of visual reliability, only between the 2 researchers who coded visual data. Reliability scores were high in this case. Here is some more coding information. The first column shows 3 tapping functions, which I explained earlier. In the second column are the categories we used to code contact space, meaning where the adult's body shared contact with the child's body. For example, contact between the adult's hand and the child's hand. Contact between the adult's hand and the child's arm, etc. We had several categories of contact space in this column. In the third column is the child's expected response to each of the adult taps. So when the adult tapped a toy, for example, introducing a new toy car, we asked whether the child responded in a manner as would be expected by the deafblind researcher. An example of an expected reaction would be that the child takes the toy from the adult and proceeds to play with it. That would constitute an expected action. If a child responded with a different action than expected, that would be unexpected action. If the child pulled away from the contact, that would be called breaks contact. If the child made no bids, it means they showed no response. Finally, we had a category marked unclear. Any questions so far? Results. Through an analysis of ethnographic notes, we theorized about the deaf-blind adult-child interactions. Important themes emerged. The deaf-blind adult did not prioritize the teaching of vocabulary to the children. Instead, she prioritized teaching the children how to get in touch and explore their environments, thereby becoming protactile. The first example of this is shown here. Anna, the child, was exploring the environment, but was using her mouth, putting it on the arm of the chair, as shown in the first picture, and moving her mouth and teeth along its length. That approach is not an appropriate means of getting information to those in the deafblind community. One should use the hands. As is shown in this picture, Yelitsa taps the child Anna on her hand, then tells her no by rubbing back and forth on Anna's mouth. In PT, swiping the hand back and forth means no. First, Yelitsa taps Anna, which is a demonstrative tap, followed by no, again on her mouth. Then, Yelitsa tapped Anna's hand, or handed her a chewy to put in her mouth, to encourage her to stop biting on things, and instead to use her hands to explore things like her chair. Over time, Anna did start exploring with her hands more often. Here is the second example with Jad. Jad was holding a toy that was resting on a baking tray. Swinging his arm and the toy beneath it off the tray. Yelitsa was tapping Jad's shoulder affirmatively, encouraging him in using his arm the way he did in the activity, demonstrating Jad's action. That was coded as meta-channel taps. Our second research question, how does the presence of the child learners shape protactile language? To analyze this, we coded taps analyzed as linguistic protactile taps, which I will explain next. First, I want to show an example of a demonstrative tap. Yelitsa is tapping on the blanket lying across a baking tray, then pulling on it. Saying, "Pull this thing." The child did do as expected and pulled the blanket. That was coded as an expected action. Description: a video of a young boy with brown hair in a red bib tugging on a blanket. Yelitsa has brown wavy hair and is tapping on the tray and encouraging the boy. Here's the second video that demonstrates the other category, meta-channel taps. Here, Yelitsa was encouraging Jad to continue tapping on the baking tray by tapping his hand when it came to rest. After her taps, he began his tapping again. These meta-channel taps are encouraging his hand use. Description: a video of a young boy with brown hair and in a red bib, who is tapping on the tray and smiling. Yelitsa produces some meta-channel taps on his hand. Here's the counts of data over time. Here we have a figure of two side-by-side panels. The panel on the left is for Anna, the panel on the right is for Jad. Time is on the x-axis with a column for each visit numbered 1 to 6 visits over time. The proportion of meta-communicative taps are in orange. The proportion of demonstrative taps are in green. And the proportion of unclear ones are shown in purple. Here you can see a clear pattern. Meta-channel taps were most predominant and were used more often than demonstrative taps. Meta-channel taps may be more accessible and more likely to be understood and interpreted by children. We also coded for types of contacts shared in adult-child interactions. On the x-axis, we have contact types. For example, the first column shows that most contact happened between the adult's hand and an object, and the child's hand was often in contact. This demonstrates that the adult and child were often interacting with objects and sharing joint attention. In the second column, we have contact between the hand of the child and hand of adult, this contact being the second most common. Then, in the next column, we have contact between the hand of the adult and the torso of the child, then the other types. The other types of contacts being less frequent. This means they are not as common, and maybe not conventionalized, and not typically used in protactile conversations. For example, the hand-to-head contact does not happen often at all in protactile. Discussion. Now I will summarize our research findings. We used ethnographic field notes and linguistic analysis of adult-child interactions among children acquiring protactile language for the first time. This was an extraordinarily unique situation we were able to observe. The first take-home message from this research is that historically, research in language development has traditionally been centered around quantitative counts of the number of words children learn, or on morphemes or syntax development. That frame offers analysis of only very superficial features. There has not been much research examining how children acquire knowledge about language use, or how to interact in language with people in their community. That social knowledge is critical. In our study, we showed that this process of acquiring social knowledge about protactile and tactile interactional practices seems to occur first, and then language exposure comes later. That became apparent in both the adult ethnographic field notes and in our linguistic analysis. Our linguistic analysis provided further evidence telling the same story. Meta-channel taps emerged as a new functional category and now exist alongside other types of protactile taps, for example, demonstrative taps. It seems that child language learners do contribute to language change, as adult speakers adjust their language to accommodate the child's mind. Those types of taps in particular are critical for socialization, teaching the child which parts of the body are appropriate for protactile. Our closing arguments are that we cannot study language on the one hand and social interactional practices on the other, separate from one another. We must study both together, which will allow us to ask questions about how interaction and language interact. Our research has supported this claim. I wish to thank my collaborators and funders, Tara Edwards, who led the study and participated in stimulating conversation, Elizia and Helene, who were heavily involved in the research process from beginning to end, NSF SBE Postdoctoral Fellowship, and NSF Rapid Grant for providing funding. Thank you very much. Any questions? Please feel free to ask now, or get in touch with me